Young Apache hid under a farmer's blankets to keep warm. His reaction shocked everyone. The prairie night was relentless. A bitter wind sliced through the wooden planks of the lonely cabin, howling through the cracks as if nature itself were trying to infiltrate. The young farmer lay on his rough straw mattress, wrapped tightly in a woolen blanket, staring up at the rafters. Sleep had been difficult for weeks. The nights were too cold, too silent, and his heart was too heavy with loneliness. He was drifting from one restless sleep to another when he heard it, a faint creak, the kind no man in a secluded cabin ever ignores. His eyes flew open. The sound of footsteps on the wooden floor reached his ears, light but deliberate. His pulse quickened. Here, on the border, every sound carried meaning. The farmer remained motionless, his muscles tense beneath the blanket. He reached for the rifle propped beside the bed, his fingers brushing the cool metal. But before he could move, he felt the weight of another body sliding beneath his covers. His breath caught in his throat. For a moment, he thought he was dreaming, that his tired mind was fabricating sensations. But the heat was real, the subtle rustle of fabric against fabric undeniable. Someone was beside him, pressed into the shadows. The farmer's heart pounded in his chest. His first thought was danger. Was this a trick? Had intruders broken into his cabin to kill him in his sleep? He remained motionless, every muscle tense, trying to calculate his next move. And then, in the faint silver light spilling through the cracks in the shutters, he glimpsed something. Dark braids framed a young face, skin flushed from the cold, eyes closed in exhausted relief. It wasn't an armed intruder. It was a girl. An Apache girl. She pulled the blanket tighter around her, shivering violently as if she'd narrowly escaped death that freezing night. She hadn't come to steal from him. She hadn't come to kill him. She'd come for warmth. The farmer's chest tightened. He knew what this meant. To the townspeople, she was the enemy. To him, she was an outsider who had broken every unspoken rule of survival. Yet in that moment, she was also something else, human, fragile, desperate. He swallowed, torn between instinct and compassion. He could push her away, drag her into the snow, and no one would ever question him. Or, he could let her stay, just for a moment, and share the only thing he had left, her warmth. The cabin was silent except for the sound of two ragged breaths beneath a blanket, one cautious, the other shaky. The farmer stared into the shadows, frozen not by the cold outside, but by the choice pressing upon him within. And then, as he stood there in disbelief, the girl's lips moved. In a voice no louder than the whisper of the wind, she murmured words that made his blood run colder than winter itself. "Please, don't let them find me." The farmer's eyes widened. Who was she running from? What had she brought into his cabin? The farmer's name was Daniel Hayes, though few there bothered to use it. To most, he was simply the boy on the edge of the prairie. 24 years old, powerfully built but worn beyond his years, Daniel had spent the last 3 winters alone. His farm lay miles from town, where the prairie grasses bent under endless winds and the land seemed to stretch on forever. The isolation was by choice, but also by circumstance. When Daniel's parents died of fever, the farm was all he had left. His older brother, Thomas, had once worked alongside him, splitting wood and laughing as if nature were his playground. But Thomas had not survived the war between settlers and Apache raiders 2 years earlier. A single arrow had ended not only a life, but the only companion Daniel had ever truly known. Since then, the farm had grown quieter with each season. The creaking of the barn door, the whining of the windmill, the barking of coyotes at night, these were Daniel's only companions. The silence oppressed him more than any loaded wagon. It seeped into his bones, a constant reminder of the emptiness of his days. Still, he persisted. He rose with the sun, plowed the stubborn soil, and worked until the horizon bled with twilight. Each day was a battle against hunger, debt, and loneliness. Yet he had learned to endure, as was expected of frontiersmen. But on long winter nights, when the fire burned low and the chill crept under the door, his resolve would break. He would lie awake listening to the storm outside and feel the weight of the silence crush him. Sometimes he imagined voices, his mother humming by the fireplace, his brother laughing at a joke only they understood. And sometimes, when the loneliness was worst, he dreamed of a touch, the warmth of another hand in his, the comfort of not being completely alone. It was these dreams, fragile, half-buried, that now collided with the reality of the young woman beneath his blankets. Daniel had spent years convincing himself he needed nothing but his land and his labor. But the truth was etched deep in his chest, he longed for connection. He longed for the warmth, not just of fire, but of another soul. Still, the practical man within him struggled with the truth. Sheltering an Apache girl wasn't just foolish, it was dangerous. In the town, tensions were intense. Every settler bore scars, physical or etched in memory. Every Apache was seen as an enemy, a threat to peace, a reminder of invasions and bloodshed. To take her in was to risk not only his farm, but his life. And yet, even knowing all this, Daniel didn't push her away. He didn't scream or raise his rifle. Instead, he froze, caught between fear and something he couldn't name. Maybe pity. Maybe defiance. Maybe the very loneliness he'd denied for so long. As the firelight flickered on the wooden walls of his cabin, Daniel realized his life had changed in the blink of an eye. The girl had crossed a line no one should cross, and now he was on the brink of a choice that would shape everything that came to come. For the first time in years, Daniel wasn't just thinking about survival. He was thinking about trust. About danger. About whether the warmth beside him was a blessing, or a curse about to consume them both. Outside, the wind howled against the shutters, shaking the cabin like a warning. Inside, Daniel lay motionless, staring at the ceiling, his mind split in two. His past had made him cautious, but his heart, wounded and buried beneath layers of silence, was stirring in ways he couldn't control. And when he finally turned his head to look at the girl again, her words from moments before echoed in his mind like a hammer against iron. "Please, don't let them find me." And why, against all reason, did Daniel feel that fate had brought her to his door? Her name was Nayeli, though Daniel wouldn't find this out until much later. For now, she was simply the girl under the blanket, her breathing ragged and her body shivering with cold. Nayeli hadn't always been alone. Just a year earlier, she'd lived among her people in a valley blooming with mesquite trees and wildflowers in spring. Her tribe was small but proud, clinging to traditions passed down from generation to generation. She'd grown up running through the tall grass, listening to her elders' stories around the campfire, and learning to weave baskets from her mother's patient hands. But the prairie was no longer safe. Skirmishes between settlers and Apache bands turned the land into a battlefield. Soldiers marched, ranchers armed themselves, and fear poisoned every encounter. Nayeli's father, a respected warrior, tried to protect his family from the violence, but fate was merciless. The night the soldiers arrived, everything changed. The camp burned down, tents collapsing in the fire and smoke. Screams echoed across the mountains. Horses neighed. Nayeli remembered grabbing her younger brother's hand, trying to drag him into the shadows. But when she staggered and looked back, he was gone. Her mother's screams were drowned out by the chaos. Her father's voice was the last thing she heard. Run. She ran that night, her bare feet touching the ground, her lungs burning as she fled into the darkness. She didn't know who had survived, or if anyone had. Since then, she had wandered, keeping to the edges of the forests, stealing what food she could, surviving on roots and melted snow. Days turned into nights, and the cold crept deeper into her bones with each passing hour. For weeks, she hid from everyone, settlers and soldiers alike. Both sides represented danger. Both sides saw her as something less than human, something to be hunted or feared. And yet, winter had no mercy on the lonely. That particular night, as the storm ravaged the prairie, Nayeli had reached her limit. Her legs ached from walking. Her lips were cracked and bleeding from the cold. She pressed her back against a tree, trying to fight the shivering, but she knew what the cold could do. She had seen men freeze before dawn, their eyes wide and their bodies rigid as stone. It was then that she saw the faint glow of fire through the cracks in a cabin window. Her heart pounded with terror and hope. A settler's cabin. Entering meant risk, she could be shot on sight. But remaining outside meant certain death. Her choice was not made out of courage, but desperation. She crept to the door, her fingers trembling as she pushed against the wood. The hinges gave way with a groan. Inside, the warmth of the fire enveloped her like a forgotten memory. She saw the figure of a man in the bed, still, perhaps asleep. Her instinct screamed to run, but her body was already collapsing. Without thinking, without planning, she slid under the covers, clutching the blanket as if it were her last defense against the world. Now, lying inches from a stranger who could end her life with a single movement, Nayeli prayed silently. She prayed he wouldn't wake. She prayed he wouldn't kick her out. Most of all, she prayed that whatever haunted her steps wouldn't follow her here. For she wasn't just running from the cold. She was running from something more, something she'd heard whispered among soldiers days before. A plan. A hunt. A determination to exterminate the remnants of her scattered people. Her eyes fluttered open in the dim light, and she caught sight of the farmer's profile beside her. He looked strong, tired, marked in his own subtle way. She wondered, in that fragile moment, if he could be trusted. But trust was a luxury she could no longer afford. All she had left now was the warmth of the blanket, the rhythm of his breathing beside hers, and a single, desperate hope, that morning would come before anyone found her. And then she whispered the words that escaped her lips before she could stop them. "Please, don't let them find me." Little did she know that those words would be engraved on Daniel's chest and would trigger a chain of events that neither of them would be able to escape. Daniel lay rigid on his straw mattress, every nerve on edge. The heat beneath the covers was undeniable, but so was the danger. He had seen Apache warriors before, fierce, unyielding, relentless when cornered. Yet the trembling body beside him did not belong to a warrior. It was too light, too fragile. Still, the danger had many faces. He shifted, the mattress creaking under his weight. Instantly, the girl's eyes flew open. They were dark, wide, piercing with fear. She bolted upright, clutching the blanket around her shoulders like armor. For a long, breathless moment, neither of them spoke. Only the crackling of the dying fire filled the silence. Daniel's voice was low, firm, but filled with suspicion. "What do you think you're doing?" The girl's lips trembled. She didn't answer at first, her eyes darting toward the door as if gauging the distance. But then, in a whisper filled with desperation, she said, "The cold would have killed me." Daniel sat up, his hand hovering near the rifle propped beside the bed. His mind warred with itself. He should expel her, every instinct, every bit of settler wisdom screamed it. But seeing her trembling, her cheeks flushed from the cold, made the words catch in his throat. "You can't just break into a man's house," he said finally, in his bed. His gaze flickered, embarrassment mixed with defiance. "Better your bed than the ground outside." "I had no choice." The firmness of the answer startled him. This was no meek invader begging for scraps, this was someone who had chosen survival boldly, even audaciously. Daniel narrowed his eyes. "You know what they'd say in town if they found you here. If they found me with you." She hugged the blanket tighter, lifting her chin despite the fear in her eyes. "I know." A pause. "But I didn't come to hurt you. I just wanted to keep you warm." The sincerity in her voice haunted him. For a moment, he saw not an enemy, nor the shadow of attacks and wars, but simply a young woman fighting to survive. But the farmer inside him, the man who had learned to be cautious, who had already lost too much, refused to be softened so easily. He leaned forward, studying her face. "Who are you running from?" he asked. "You whispered, didn't you? Don't let them find me." "Who's after you?" Her eyes flickered, and for the first time, he saw the depth of her fear. Her lips parted as if to respond, but closed again. Silence hung between them, heavy and suffocating. Daniel exhaled sharply, running his hand over his face. He wanted solitude, peace, a life without problems. Yet there was trouble, sitting wrapped in his blanket, staring at him with eyes too haunted for someone so young. He spoke again, quieter this time, almost against his own will. "If I let you stay, I'll be in danger. Do you understand that?" His answer came quickly, almost desperately. "Then I'll leave at dawn. Just, let me spend the night." Something in her tone cracked the armor Daniel had built around his own heart. He remembered his own nights when the cold had nearly destroyed him. He remembered lying awake, wishing he had someone, anyone, with whom to share the darkness. His hand dropped from the rifle. He sighed, leaning back against the wall. "Okay. Just the night. But no tricks." For the first time, her shoulders relaxed. She nodded slightly, her eyes shining in the dim light of the fireplace. Then she sat back down on the mattress, careful to maintain a respectful distance, as if afraid that even a slight brush of her hand might push him over the edge. Daniel closed his eyes, though sleep didn't come easily. Every second, he remained aware of her breathing beside him, the soft rustle of fabric as she moved, the way warmth spread through the bed in a way it hadn't in years. He told himself it would only be until morning. One night. Then she would leave, and life would return to its silent emptiness. But deep inside, a small voice whispered what his mind refused to admit, nothing that night would leave him unchanged. Underscore 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 underscore. The cabin was silent except for the sigh of the wind and the soft crackle of the dying fire in the grate. Daniel stood motionless, staring up at the rafters above, while Nayeli huddled under the blanket, her back to him. Neither of them was asleep. The space between them was thick with a tension thicker than the logs stacked in the corner. The minutes stretched into hours. Daniel thought he could survive the silence, but her voice came first, quiet, hesitant, as if speaking more to herself than to him. "I wasn't made to be alone." Daniel turned his head slightly, surprised. Her words carried the weight of something broken, something unfinished. He remained silent, waiting. After a pause, she continued. "My people, they are gone. Scattered. Some dead. Some taken." His voice wavered, then steadied. "I walked until I couldn't feel my feet anymore. The cold pierced me like knives. If I stopped, I wouldn't get up again. That's why I came." Daniel gritted his teeth. He had no reason to trust her words, and yet, the tremor in her voice wasn't something that could be faked. He recognized it, for he carried the same tremor deep within himself. He shifted, resting his elbows on his knees. "Do you think you're the only one who has lost people?" His voice came out harsher than he intended. "My brother, Thomas, was taken from me by you. An arrow, straight to the chest. He was all I had." The words hung in the dark, sharp as broken glass. Nayeli turned, her dark eyes searching his face. For a moment, her lips parted as if she might argue, deny, or defend herself. But instead, she merely whispered, "I am really sorry." The simplicity of it surprised him. No protest, no excuse, just sadness. Daniel's chest tightened. He expected anger or silence, not this quiet acknowledgement of pain. The silence that followed was different now, not heavy with fear, but fragile, like ice on a stream. They both knew it could break at any moment. Finally, Nayeli asked softly, "And since then, have you lived alone?" Daniel nodded, though his gaze was distant. "The earth keeps me alive, but it doesn't fill the void." His voice lowered. "Some nights, it feels like the silence is going to crush me." Nayeli pulled the blanket tighter around her shoulders, studying him. "You are strong," she said calmly, "but strength without others is only half of life." Her words hit him harder than he cared to admit. For years, he'd told himself that solitude was safer, that not needing anyone meant not losing anyone. But hearing her say it out loud made the truth undeniable. He wasn't living, just surviving. The fire crackled, shadows stretching across the wooden walls. Daniel leaned back, closing his eyes for a moment. Then he heard her again, her voice softer, more fragile. "When I ran, I thought I would die with no one to remember me. No name, no songs, no nothing." She swallowed hard. "But tonight, for the first time, I'm not alone. Even if it ends tomorrow, I'll have shared this warmth." Daniel opened his eyes and turned to her. She wasn't looking at him anymore. Her gaze was fixed on the flickering embers, her profile etched in gold and shadow. She looked young, too young to carry such pain, and yet her words carried the weight of someone twice her age. For reasons he couldn't explain, something in him changed. The distrust, the caution, they didn't disappear, but they loosened. He realized he wanted to know more about her. He wanted to hear her voice again, to fill the silence that had haunted him for years. But before he could speak, she stepped closer, not quite touching, but close enough for him to feel the warmth of her body against his arm. It was a small, almost accidental gesture, but it hit Daniel like a hammer against a stone. He didn't move. He didn't push her away. Instead, he let the moment pass, the silence no longer suffocating, but strangely comforting. The two, united by loss, united by survival, remained in that fragile truce while the storm raged outside. The prairie wind howled as if trying to tear the cabin apart, but within those four walls, a different kind of storm was brewing, one of trust, of compassion, of something neither dared to name yet. And when Daniel finally closed his eyes, his last thought before falling into a restless sleep was not of fear, nor of hatred, but of a question that lodged in his chest like an ember refusing to die. "Why do I want her to stay?" Underscore 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 underscore. The storm had broken just before dawn. When Daniel opened his eyes, pale sunlight filtered through the cracks in the closed window. The cabin smelled of damp wood and cold ash. For a moment, he thought the strange encounter that night had been a dream, until he turned and saw her. Nayeli was still there, huddled under the blanket, breathing slowly and evenly. A strand of dark hair had fallen across her cheek, and her hand rested inches from his. Something about her sleeping face struck Daniel, soft, vulnerable, unprotected. So different from the hardened mask she wore when awake. For the first time in years, he didn't wake up to the hollow silence of being alone. But the illusion of peace was broken by the sound of hooves outside. Daniel's body stiffened. He stood quickly, his boots clicking against the ground, and peered through the narrow crack between the shutters. Two men on horseback were slowly crossing the edge of his property, neighbors, settlers from the nearest town. Their rifles hung from their saddles, unconcerned but always within reach. He swore under his breath. Nayeli stirred, sensing the change in him. Her eyes snapped open, instantly alert. "What is it?" she whispered. Daniel turned, his voice low and urgent. "Stay down. Don't make any noise." She obeyed, slipping silently off the cot and crouching against the wall, pulling the blanket tightly to hide her body. Her movements were instinctive, she had lived too long with danger lurking not to know how to disappear. Outside, the men stopped their horses near the fence. Daniel opened the cabin door and stepped out onto the porch, forcing his body into the familiar posture of weary indifference. "Morning," one of the men called out. His name was Jed, a broad-shouldered farmer with hawk-like eyes. "I heard the storm got bad around here. Are you holding up okay?" Daniel nodded. "Cabin maintained. Nothing new." Jed's gaze flicked from Daniel to the cabin, as if searching for movement. The other man, Clay, shifted in his saddle, chewing on a piece of straw. "Funny thing," Clay spoke slowly. "Yesterday, footprints were seen near the creek. Smaller than a man's boot. The team thinks it may have been one of these rogue Apaches." Daniel's pulse quickened, though his face remained still. The storm erased a lot of tracks. It could have been anything. Jed leaned forward on the reins, his expression hard. "Maybe. But keep an eye out. The last thing we need is a fugitive sneaking around. A dangerous guy." Daniel forced a tight smile. "I will stand guard." The men stood there for a moment longer, suspicion flaring in their eyes, before they nudged their horses and rode on. Their silhouettes faded against the bright horizon until they were mere dots among the rolling hills. Daniel waited until the sound of hooves had completely faded before going back inside. Nayeli emerged from the shadows, her body tense. "They hunt me." Daniel closed the door firmly, leaning his back against it. "They don't know. Not yet." He ran his hand through his hair. "But they're watching. One false move and they'll come with more than questions." For the first time since the night before, fear shone openly in his eyes. "If they find me here, they'll kill me. And you too." Daniel met her gaze, something silent passing between them. She was right. Taking her in wasn't just dangerous, it was a death sentence if discovered. Yet he heard his own voice responding in defiance of reason. "Then we'll make sure they don't." Nayeli blinked in surprise. "Would you risk that?" Daniel swallowed hard and clenched his jaw. "You came to me half dead in the storm. I couldn't drive you out then. I won't be able to now." A long silence fell, but this time it wasn't suspicion that filled it, it was something heavier, something binding. They both understood that the stakes had changed. Outside, the prairie shone fresh and rain-washed, but inside the cabin, a new storm was brewing, a storm of suspicion, loyalty, and the dangerous choice Daniel had just made. And though neither of them dared say it out loud, they both knew there was no turning back. The days that followed felt unreal to Daniel, as if time itself had changed. His cabin, once silent except for the creaking of wood and the soft crackling of the fire, was now alive with another presence. At first, Nayeli moved like a shadow, quiet, reserved, always alert to any danger. She spoke little, her words were curt, her gaze wary. She wouldn't eat until Daniel took the first bite, as if every kindness were a test she feared would vanish the moment she tried. But Daniel was patient. He didn't press her with questions. Instead, he continued his work as usual, mending fences, chopping wood, feeding the cattle, and let her decide when to join him. It was on the third morning, while he was chopping logs behind the cabin, that she stepped out into the sunlight. He looked up in surprise as she knelt silently beside him, picking up the smaller pieces of wood and stacking them neatly. For a moment, he almost told her not to bother. But the firm set of her jaw stopped him. She wanted to help. She wanted to belong, even if just a little. From then on, she followed him in the rhythm of his days. When he carried water from the well, she balanced the buckets. When he checked the fences, she followed, her sharp gaze detecting weaknesses he had overlooked. She moved with the grace of someone who had spent her life reading the land, and Daniel began to realize that what she lacked in words, she made up for in instinct. One afternoon, as he cultivated the soil in preparation for spring planting, she squatted at the edge of the field and pressed her palm against the earth. "Very wet here," she murmured. "Wait, or the seeds will drown." Daniel blinked in surprise. She was right. He had almost made a mistake that would cost him weeks of labor. He gave her a small, respectful nod. "It seems like I could learn a thing or two from you." For the first time, a faint smile appeared on her lips. It was fleeting, almost hidden, but enough to warm the space between them. At night, by the fire, their conversation would linger. She would tell him fragments of her people's stories, tales of spirits who lived in rivers and stars, guiding hunters home. Her voice softened when she spoke of her younger brother, whom she still believed might be alive somewhere. Daniel, for his part, spoke of his childhood on the prairie. How he had come west with his parents, how disease had taken them, how he had built this cabin with his own hands because there was no one else to build it for him. The silences between their words were no longer heavy. They became comfortable, filled with the quiet crackling of the fire and the unspoken bond that formed in their shared solitude. But even as this fragile trust grew, the outside world did not forget them. When Daniel arrived in town to look for supplies, he noticed the lookouts were lingering a little too long. Jed, the farmer, asked again if he'd seen any signs of stray animals. Clay murmured that the soldiers would be passing through soon, sweeping the area. Daniel responded with the same calm facade as before, but inside, discomfort consumed him. He knew he was walking a tightrope, one slip, and the peace he'd built with Nayeli could crumble. That night, when he returned home, he found her at the edge of the pasture, watching the horizon with a wary gaze. "They are looking," she said softly, not needing to ask what he had heard. Daniel placed his hand on the fence post, his eyes following hers toward the fading light. "Let them search. They won't find you here." For a long moment, she studied him, this man who owed her nothing, yet who stood between her and the world that haunted her. Then, with a sigh that sounded almost like relief, she whispered, "You are not like the others." The words touched something deep inside him, something he'd buried long ago. He didn't know what to say, so he simply stood beside her, watching the sun set behind the hills. And though neither of them dared speak of it yet, they both knew that their lives were no longer their own. They were bound together now, by choice and by fate. The prairie was silent that night, the kind of silence that makes every sound carry farther than it should. Daniel had just locked the barn doors, the sky painted in streaks of red and gold. Inside the cabin, Nayeli prepared a simple meal, her movements steady now, no longer the trembling fugitive he had sheltered at first. For a moment, it seemed almost normal. Almost like the life Daniel had never dared to dream of. Then came the sound. Hooves. Lots of them. Approaching quickly. Daniel froze, holding his breath. I knew immediately it wasn't Jed or Clay this time, it was heavier, more determined. Soldiers. He ran inside, his face pale. "Nayeli. Hide. Now." Her eyes widened, but she didn't question him. She grabbed the blanket from the bed and hid behind the false wall Daniel had built years ago to store tools. It wasn't much, but it was better than nothing. She slammed the boards shut just as fists pounded on the cabin door. "Open. United States Cavalry." Daniel's heart was pounding, but he forced himself to move with deliberate calm. He opened the door and found 3 soldiers in blue coats, rifles slung over their shoulders, and Jed standing proudly beside them. Daniel's stomach tightened. "Jed? Of course. Good evening, farmer, or soldier leader native. We're tracking signs of Apache movement around here. This man here said there's been some unusual activity on his land." Jed crossed his arms, smiling. "I saw smoke coming from your chimney when the storm was at its worst. Footprints too, smaller than a man's boot. I figured you might have company." Daniel's blood boiled, but he kept his face expressionless. "I've been alone all winter. Feel free to take a look, but you'll be wasting your time." The soldier narrowed his eyes. "We will be the judges of that." Without waiting for permission, the men entered. Boots echoed on the wooden floor, rifles banged against the doorframe. They began to search the cabin, lifting blankets, opening crates, overturning small barrels. Daniel clenched his fists, standing rigid as he watched them dismantle his life piece by piece. Each second felt like an eternity. He could hear Nayeli's labored breathing behind the false wall, could feel the hum of her fear as if it were his own. A soldier stopped near the hidden space. His hand pressed against the boards. Daniel's heart nearly stopped. "What is that?" the soldier muttered. Daniel stepped forward quickly, his voice firm but harsh. "Storage. Tools and junk I don't want to trip over. Nothing worthwhile." The soldier gave him a long look and then smiled. "Funny how you're so protective of it." He began to reach for the latch. Daniel moved instinctively, placing himself between the soldier and the wall. His eyes locked with the man's. "I told you there's nothing there." Tension crackled like lightning. For a moment, Daniel thought the soldier might react, force a confrontation. But then Jed's voice interrupted him. "He's hiding something. I can feel it." The officer approached, his shadow long in the dim firelight. "If you lie, farmer, you will be accused of aiding the enemy. That is treason." Daniel gritted his teeth. He said nothing. The officer studied him for a moment longer and then finally lifted his chin. "Search the barn. If you don't find anything there, we'll move on." The soldiers stomped out, their boots leaving mud on the cabin floor. Jed remained in the doorway, a cruel smile on his face. "You're a fool, Daniel. Protecting them only brings trouble. You'll see." When the door closed behind them, silence filled the room. Daniel exhaled, his body shaking with the adrenaline rush he'd ingested. Slowly, he moved to the false wall and opened it. Nayeli emerged, her face pale and her hands trembling. She had heard every word. "They won't stop," she whispered, her voice breaking. "If they come again." Daniel interrupted her, his tone fierce. "Then we'll be ready. You're safe here. I swore." But even as he said those words, doubt gnawed at him. Jed wouldn't give up. The soldiers would return. And next time, Daniel might not be able to protect her. Yet in that fragile moment, with the embers casting their glow over her face, he knew one thing for sure: whatever storm lay ahead, they would weather it together. And somewhere deep down, Nayeli allowed herself to believe him. Underscore 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 underscore. The following days passed under a shadow heavier than any storm. Daniel continued working on the farm, but every blow of his axe, every step in the pasture, carried the weight of fear. Nayeli moved silently, but he could see the fear tightening her shoulders, the way her eyes constantly scanned the horizon. And then it happened. Just before dusk, the sound of hooves echoed again. This time, there were more of them, half a dozen soldiers, rifles drawn, with Jed riding at the front. Daniel's blood ran cold. Within, he hissed at Nayeli. She ran to the false wall, but before she could disappear, Daniel grabbed her hand. Their eyes met in that single, desperate blink. No matter what happens, keep quiet. She nodded, though her hand trembled in his. Then she disappeared into hiding, and Daniel turned to face the inevitable. The soldiers dismounted with the precision of wolves surrounding prey. Jed advanced arrogantly, his voice loud enough to be heard. I told you he was hiding something. Time to dig it up. The officer pushed Daniel aside as his men spread out across the cabin with ruthless efficiency. This time, they weren't indifferent, they were determined. They ripped up floorboards, smashed crates, and scattered food and tools. One man kicked the water barrel, sending it scattering across the dirt floor. And then, the sound Daniel had feared, a soldier's voice coming from the wall. Sir! There's a hole here. Daniel's chest tightened. He instinctively took a step forward. They're tools. I told you. The officer scoffed. We'll see. The soldier ripped away the boards. And in that instant, the fragile line Daniel had been walking shattered. Nayeli's eyes gleamed in the dim light as she was yanked roughly into the open space, her body bucking, her voice breaking into screams of fury and fear. Jed's face lit with cruel triumph. There she is. A savage pest. Just like I said. The officer raised his rifle. Take her out. She will be transported with the others. Something in Daniel snapped. He'd experienced loss, loneliness, a silence so profound it nearly buried him alive. But he wouldn't, stand by, watching her be carried away like an animal. His hand moved before he could think. He grabbed the iron poker beside the fire and swung it hard, hitting the nearest soldier in the jaw. The man fell with a grunt, his rifle clattering to the ground. Chaos ensued. Nayeli wrenched free of the soldier's grasp, ducking as another man advanced toward her. Daniel grabbed the fallen rifle, leveling it with a firmness that came not from practice but from fury. Nobody touches her, he roared. The cabin erupted in violence, fists, boots, screams, the metal of the weapon glinting in the firelight. Nayeli fought like a cornered fox, agile and ferocious, attacking with every ounce of strength she had left. Daniel, bigger and stronger, fought with the desperation of a man who had finally found something worth losing again. Jed backed away, smirking, until Daniel's rifle swung at him. His smirk faltered, replaced by a hint of fear. You're making a mistake, farmer, he spat. Protecting her will ruin you. Daniel's voice was low, firm, and unyielding. I would rather ruin myself than become you. Outside, a shot rang out, savage, warning, echoing across the prairie. The soldiers staggered, regrouped, realizing this was no longer a simple search, but a battle they could lose. One of them swore under his breath. Requiem. Regroup. Within moments, the cabin emptied, the sound of boots thumping as the men mounted their horses. Jed stood in the doorway, his face contorted with hatred. This isn't over, he growled. They'll come back, with more men. And you won't stand a chance. Daniel slammed the door behind him, his chest heaving, sweat and blood burning on his forehead. For a long, shaky moment, the only sound was their labored breathing. Nayeli grabbed his arm, her eyes wide but burning with something fierce. You fought for me. Daniel looked at her, really looked, and felt the weight of his choice settle over him. He had crossed a line of no return. No, he said calmly, his voice rough and true, I fought for us. And in that moment, though the danger had only increased, though the outside world threatened to crush them, the bond between them became unbreakable. Underscore 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 underscore. The cabin was in ruins. Boards ripped out, tools scattered, water soaking the dirt floor. The smell of gunpowder hung in the air, mingled with the smoke from the felled firewood. Yet, amidst the wreckage, two figures remained standing. Daniel's body ached with bruises and cuts, but his spirit felt strangely lighter. He looked at Nayeli, her chest heaving, strands of dark hair sticking to her damp skin. Her eyes, so filled with fear days before, now burned with flames. Not the fire of terror, but of survival. "They will return," she whispered. Her voice was firm, though her hands were shaking. Daniel nodded. "I know." For a moment, silence fell, heavy with unspoken truths. They couldn't stay there. Jed wouldn't give in, and the soldiers would return in greater numbers. The hut that had once been Daniel's sanctuary was no longer a refuge, it was a trap. Daniel turned toward the destroyed door, gazing out at the prairie that stretched endlessly beyond. He thought of all the years he'd spent chained to this land, trying to fill the silence of loss with work. He'd built this place with his own hands, but in the end, wood and walls meant nothing. What mattered now was at his side. "Then let's go," he said finally. "Tonight. Before dawn." Nayeli's eyes widened. "Leave everything?" Daniel's voice softened. "Everything I need, I already have." The words struck her deeply, and for the first time, tears filled her eyes, not of sadness, but of something she hadn't felt in a long time, hope. That night, under the cover of darkness, they packed what little they could carry: food, water, a rifle, a blanket. Daniel saddled his horse, steadying it as Nayeli climbed onto its back, her figure framed by the pale glow of the moonlight. He approached her, the weight of his decision pressing down on him, but the feeling was one of freedom rather than a burden. As they rode across the prairie, the cold wind beating against their faces, the cabin grew smaller behind them until it became just a speck swallowed by the horizon. Daniel didn't look back. Nayeli didn't either.